Good afternoon. I'm Jim Morrison, the president of the Hudson River Environmental Society. Welcome to part two of the Hudson River fish in an ever-changing ecosystem. Little background information on HRES. 51 years after the founding of HRS in 1970 as a non-advocacy organization, we have continued to be a conduit for communication of important environmental issues between members of the research community, resource agency, scientists, consulting firms, decision makers, and citizens of the Hudson Valley. We are a member-supported organization, and with your support, we're able to keep our conferences registration fees down, provide travel stipends, research grants to students, and keep the Hudson Valley informed on the environmental issues that matter the most. The ideas for our programs and the resources employed to produce them come from our members. And if you want more information on HRES, please check out our website is hres.org. I'd now like to introduce Clay Hiles, the Executive Director of the Hudson River Foundation.
Hello, I want to add my welcome to Jim's. To all of you have shown a terrific response to this series. And I want to again thank Jim Morrison and Chuck Nieder, especially for their extraordinary efforts to develop such a productive agenda and assemble the broad and deep expertise that the presenters today and in the other programs in this series represent. We should all be especially very grateful to Jim Lodge, who has been the Foundation's torchbearer for the series. Jim keeps me on a very short leash, and last week at our first session, I confined myself to remembering Dennis Seskowski, to whom this webinar series is dedicated, as a particularly fitting way to honor and acknowledge his contributions to Hudson River science and to building the community of scientists dedicated to the environment and environmentalists dedicated to science. I offered a brief summary of the Foundation's work in its 40th anniversary year and the important contribution of these webinars to our planning for the future of the Foundation as I turn its reins over to Jonathan Kramer, our next Executive Director. I asked for a couple of minutes separately today just to focus on what we consider to be the overriding and underlying focus of our commitment and our planning for the next 40 years. The core of that is our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. When I first came to the Hudson River from a career in civil rights, I was dismayed by the disconnect between interest in the environment and concerns about social and racial justice. We've come a long way since then, and I salute all of you who have increased and renewed your personal and organizational commitment to DEIJ. But I want, as we go through this webinar series, to remember that though it may seem a considerable distance between the esoterica of some of the things that we will be discussing and the importance of inclusion and diversity and justice, I want you to keep those things in mind. I hope we all keep those things in mind. I'm talking to myself. Particularly as we look to the future, how we take what we're learning from this series and put it into programs of scientific and including social science research. And with that, let's get started.
Yeah, thanks, Clay. I just have a couple of quick notes on the structure for the webinar and the way we're going to organize the Q&A. So first things, that this is being recorded. And we are trying to allocate keep to our allocated time slots of 25 minutes. So we will not be having the speakers answering questions until the end during our Q&A. There is a Q&A box, a chat box that says Q&A on it, and we encourage you to put questions for speakers in there to help us keep organized. We also ask that you identify the speaker you're asking the questions of, just their name and then what the question is. And at the end of this session during the Q&A, Chuck and I will have assembled all those questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer at least the majority of them in the allocated time. If there are any technical problems, we also ask you to put those into the chat, or and we'll try to address them as quickly as possible. And the final note is, if there is some large technical hurdle challenge, we will stop this webinar and then restart it in approximately 10 minutes. We don't think that's likely to happen, but we just want to be prepared. And with that, I'll turn it to Chuck.
Well, good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining us. Just give you a brief introduction of the seminar, and then we'll get right to it. We started planning this symposium long before COVID, and long before the pandemic disrupted our lives. That meant we had a lot of time to plan for this. So this is over 1 year in the making, and hopefully it will show that to you today. The content of this is basically, it's a 5-week series with a 2-hour session each week, and each session is of its own, can stand alone, but put together certainly tells a much bigger picture of what we know about Hudson River fish and the stressors they face. Another unique thing this time around is we've teamed up with Hudson River Foundation. We often do certainly collaborate with them on these seminars, but this one even more so. It's important to us because Hudson River Foundation has close ties with the research community and has knowledge about the current science and where the research gaps are. And as Clay said, they're looking to the future. A new executive director coming on and developing strategic plan for the future of the research they support, and it's really great that they're going to draw upon the expertise we've pulled together in this series. And then finally, this is a dedication to Dennis Seskowski, who was a colleague, mentor, and friend to many of us. And as Jim said, we gave some time at the end for you to write in questions. So we ask you write them in as we go along, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So I thank you for taking the time to participate today. And so without further delay, I'm going to go right to our first speaker. And so first up, we have John Borman. And Dr. Borman, I'm really excited about this. I've been wanting to get him involved in one of our series for a long time. He was dealing with one of the stressors way back when, and in the 70s. And one of really the stressor that most concerned folks, and that was the energy development on the Hudson River. So a little bit of background about John. He got his undergraduate degree at SUNY ESF, his PhD from Cornell. He started out at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a member of the power plant team, and he'll be talking about a lot of that work in just a minute. He then moved on to National Marine Fisheries Service with NOAA. He became the director of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and then the director of the Office of Science and Technology before he retired in 2008. But that certainly, he didn't just disappear then. He's now adjunct professor at the North Carolina State U. A little bit more, he was the past president of AFS. He was on the Hudson River Foundation Board of Directors for 10 years. And so we've asked him to come back to the Hudson Valley and relive his early work on studying the stressors that most concerned scientists and resource managers at the time. And so with that, Dr. Borman, take it away. So you're on mute still.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Again, I'd like to thank the Hudson River Environmental Society and the Hudson River Foundation for inviting me to speak today. It's kind of exciting to revisit some territory that I was involved with back about 40, 50 years ago. I want to especially thank Chuck Nieder and Jim Lodge and Sam Gordon for their advice and support in putting my presentation together. I will also try to do justice on behalf of the hundreds of scientists involved in Hudson River studies during the power plant era. Any errors or omission or misinterpretations are purely my own, so I'll take full responsibility for what I say. Mentioned last week and this week that this seminar series is dedicated to Dennis Seskowski. Dennis, like many of you, he was a good friend of mine, miss him very much. I first met Dennis in the early 80s when he was still working for a different agency in New York. We met during the Westway project, Westway fiasco, or whatever you want to call it. So I've known Dennis, I had known Dennis for well over 40 years. So my professional involvement with the Hudson River started in 1974 when I was assigned to coordinate the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service Joint Task Force assigned to the Federal Power Commission Storm King hearings. I then became an expert witness and technical advisor to EPA during the Hudson River power case and participated in the subsequent settlement negotiations. Today, I'd like to briefly cover the history of power plant operations as they relate to Hudson River biota, go into more detail about the Hudson River power case and its settlement, and finish with a few lessons learned and some closing remarks. The data I'll be sharing is what was available at the time that testimony and associated exhibits were prepared. So I won't be showing any new data, just data we had back in the 1970s and early 80s. My narrative begins in the early 1960s with the construction and operation of Indian Point Unit 1, which was located almost 40 miles upriver from the battery. It's still there, but it's not running anymore. The initial environmental concern about the operation of the nuclear plant was the effects of thermal discharge on Hudson River fishes. This became a prominent issue during the time, and including a cover story in Scientific American, which I remember as a student back in the university, remember reading, and also watching Mike Wallace do an expose on 60 Minutes on Indian Point Unit 1. By the way, you may ask why there's a smokestack at the nuclear unit, this picture here of Unit 1 in the lower left-hand corner. I asked the same question and was told that when the unit started operation, it could not get the steam hot enough to drive the turbines efficiently. So they had to install a gas-fired afterburner in order to get the plant to operate properly. I thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit. Around the same time as concerns were raised about thermal discharge, Sports Illustrated published an article exposing the disposal of large striped bass that were killed at the Indian Point unit intake, and these were being disposed at a local dump site. The author of the article, Bob Boyle, was an outdoor writer for Sports Illustrated who went on to advocate for conservation of Hudson River biota by authoring several books, founding the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, bringing suit against GE for PCB pollution in the upper Hudson River, and establishing the Hudson River Keeper program, among other activities. In the mid-1960s, Con Ed, operator of Indian Point, proposed construction of a pump storage facility immediately upriver from Indian Point, utilizing the sheer drop of Storm King Mountain as a means of generating power. The idea was that since nuclear power plants cannot be easily switched on and off, power generated during off-peak hours would be used to pump water up to a reservoir at the top of Storm King to be released down to hydroelectric turbines during peak demand periods through tunnels inside the mountain. Originally, the tunnels were intended to go on the outside of the mountain, disrupting the scenic beauty of the Hudson area of the Hudson called the Hudson Highlands. The Scenic Hudson Preservation Council sued the Federal Power Commission, claiming that the proposed facility would not be in the public interest because of the degradation of the scenic vista in the Hudson's Highlands. The court ruled in favor of Scenic Hudson, directing that environmental concerns be taken into account when licensing a federally sponsored project. This famous case, Scenic Hudson versus FPC, paved the way for passage of NEPA in 1969. Whoops. I'm missing a slide here. I don't know how that happened. But for those of you unfamiliar with the terms, entrainment means passage of aquatic organisms. Wait a minute, excuse me. Okay, I'm missing a slide here, so I apologize. But enactment of NEPA in 1969 and the Clean Water Act in 1972 ushered in a golden decade for power plant impact assessment. The EIS for Indian Point Unit 2 raised the issue of entrainment and impingement mortality due to power plant cooling. The Long River Survey, conducted by the Hudson River utility companies to support their request for an exemption to upgrading cooling water intake technology, began in earnest in 1974. At around the same time, measurements of elevated levels of PCB in Hudson River striped bass led to a closure of the in-river fishery for the species in 1976. This closure complicated subsequent assessments of population level effects of entrainment and impingement mortality on the species. Finally, in the latter half of the 1970s, the EPA issued a permit requirement for cooling towers at Indian Point, Roseton, Danskammer, and Bowline Point, leading to the Hudson River Power case litigation that would continue through the remainder of the decade. For those of you unfamiliar with terms, entrainment means passage of aquatic organisms through the intake screening and through the power plant's cooling water system. Generally, organisms less than 50 millimeters in length are vulnerable to entrainment, which encompasses most of the early life stages of the Hudson River fishes. Impingement occurs when organisms are sucked against the intake screening, but are too large to be drawn through the power plant's cooling water system. The principal power plants involved in the case, again, were Bowline Point, Lovett, Indian Point, Roseton, and Danskammer. The Hudson River Power case was a test case for Section 316A, which allowed exemptions for thermal discharge, and 316B, which required best available technology to minimize adverse impact. These are 316A and B of the Clean Water Act. In other words, utilities couldn't address thermal discharge requirements simply by drawing more cooling water through the plant. As an aside, power plants are the only source of discharge listed in the Clean Water Act that can be exempted from regulation if a demonstration of minimal biological impacts can be made. The Clean Water Act permit requirement for cooling towers at the major Hudson River facilities was contested jointly by the 5 utility companies involved: Con Ed, Pasney, Central Hudson, Orange and Rockland, and Niagara Mohawk. The major facilities, denoted here as red dots, were located primarily at the freshwater saltwater interface of the Hudson River Estuary. This part of the estuary is an area of high productivity and functions as spawning and nursery habitats for anadromous and resident species. The blue dot indicates the location of the proposed Storm King pump storage facility, which was tangentially involved in the Hudson River Power case. EPA's case was relatively straightforward. In accordance with the requirements under the Clean Water Act, EPA initially determined that cooling towers at the major facilities constituted best available technology that would minimize impact to the Hudson River fish populations. Several parties joined in the case on EPA's side, including the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, New York DEC, Scenic Hudson Preservation Council, and the Natural Resource Defense Council. Utility companies claimed that the effects of entrainment and impingement mortality on the Hudson River fishes was already close to minimal. And what technologies other than expensive, and that technologies other than expensive cooling towers should suffice to reduce the effects even further. These technologies included elaborate intake screening systems, including fine mesh screens, variable speed pumps, and timely outages for planned maintenance. The companies also claimed that at the population level, mortality on early life stages would be offset by density-dependent mechanisms that improve the survival chances of those individuals not killed by the plants. Parties to the case chose to focus the court arguments on 7 fish species: the anadromous striped bass, American shad, and river herring being a collective term for blueback herring and alewife, as we learned last week, the resident white perch and Atlantic tomcod populations, and bay anchovy, which is primarily a marine species, but an extremely important component of the Hudson River food web. In the next few slides, taken from my court testimony at the time, I'll give you some indication of the vulnerability of some of these fish species to mortality induced by the power plants. The graphs show examples of the relative concentration of early life stages in the long river sampling regions of the river, which extended from George Washington Bridge up to the Troy Dam. The red dots indicate the locations of the major power plants, and the blue dot is where the proposed Storm King plant is located. The species exemplified are striped bass, American shad, Atlantic tomcod, and bay anchovy. For striped bass, most of the early life stages that are at risk of entrainment are concentrated in the power plant regions of the river, as you can see here. Surveys conducted later in the season, extending through the fall, indicate the vulnerability of the latter early life stages of striped bass to impingement-related mortality. And these were the beach seine surveys conducted in the shore zones of the river, and again, the Long River survey, this time sampling the larger juvenile striped bass, greater than 50 millimeters. American shad early life stages are generally further upstream from the power plants, reflecting the tendency of shad to spawn in fresher water than striped bass. And hence their early life stages are less vulnerable to entrainment by the major plants on the river. Atlantic tomcod spawn in the power plant regions, but the early life stages move further downriver than striped bass and shad. Tomcod also spawn during the winter months as opposed to the spring for the other species. As noted in the talks last week, Hudson River tomcod are at the southern end of the range for the species, and climate change is threatening to contract that range further northward. Bay anchovy utilize the lowest regions of the river for spawning and nursery habitats, but adults can measure less than 50 millimeters, meaning all life stages of the species present in the power plant regions are vulnerable to entrainment to some extent. The main issue of contention with bay anchovy is how much of an exchange occurs between the coastal segment of the population and the segment within the Hudson River proper. Utilities use this argument to downplay the impacts of entrainment in the Hudson, which was estimated to be very high for that segment of the population. Expert witnesses for the utility companies based their estimates of power plant-induced mortality on a two-dimensional hydrodynamic model. It's called the real-time life cycle model, which superimposed the hydrodynamics with biological characteristics of the early life stages of the fishes, such as life stage duration and growth rates. While the model didn't incorporate specific mechanisms to account for density-dependent effects, it used a Rickert-type stock recruitment function to characterize the potential population-level effects of early life stage mortality. The model was expensive and time consuming to run because it was very elaborate. The model used by the technical experts for EPA was essentially an expanded equation of probabilities and did not extrapolate the estimates of early life stage mortality to potential population level effects. The probabilities used in the equation included the chance of an early life stage being in a particular region of the river in a given week, based on the long river survey. Also, the chance of being withdrawn by any power plant in that region, and the chance of dying from passage through the cooling water system of that power plant. The equation could be run on a hand calculator in a matter of seconds and gave essentially the same estimate of entrainment-induced mortality when run side by side with the utilities model using the same input data. By early 1980, the EPA and co-parties had agreed to take the cooling tower requirement off the table if the utilities could demonstrate significant reductions in mortality by using other means. The negotiating point was 50% towards the reduction that would be achieved if cooling towers were operating. Both sides agreed to use the ETM as the basis for trying the different combinations of technology and outages to achieve the desired outcome, again, because it was quick to run and inexpensive. Con Ed also agreed to withdraw its license application for Storm King and continue the river-wide monitoring program. Another important part of the settlement was the donation of $12 million by the utilities to establish the Hudson River Foundation. So since the settlement in 1981, a number of power plants on the Hudson River have been taken offline, including, most importantly, the Indian Point nuclear facilities. Operation at other plants have been reduced to the point where overall cooling water withdrawal at the major plants is now 40% of what it was in the 1970s, and would have been reduced by close to 90% if Storm King had been in operation at the time of the settlement, but subsequently taken offline. Oops. Oh, here we go. So taking advantage of 2020 hindsight, I learned several important lessons from the Hudson River Power case. I'll share a couple of them here. First, the power plant impact studies focused on the effects of entrainment mortality on the 7 fish species of interest, as we've discussed. However, the plants did not selectively remove these species from the river. The plants also removed and killed other biota along with these species, including their predators and forage. This has important implications for effects of the plants on overall system productivity. Also, power plant induced mortality on early life stages needs to be placed in a broader context of all mortality risks for those species induced by humans, especially when one of those other risks, the force of fishing, can be intense. Take striped bass, for example. Striped bass is a species that can live 20 years or more, and for many of those years, it runs the risk of fishing mortality. It is exposed to the risk of power plant mortality only during its first year of life, assuming impingement effects are now minimized by improved intake technology. If one looks at how much of a reduction in fishing mortality is needed to offset the effects of entrainment mortality on lifetime egg production of an age 1 recruit to the population, the results are striking. For example, a 10% reduction in the rate of fishing can offset more than a 50% reduction in age 1 recruits due to entrainment mortality. This was the basis for the argument that Phil Goodyear and I used in the early 1980s as co-managers of the Coastwide Emergency Striped Bass Study to convince the Atlantic states to reduce fishing on striped bass to recover its abundance. The states agreed to collectively cut fishing mortality on striped bass by 50%, which was enough to restore the population abundance in a matter of a few years. In closing, the Hudson River case led to several important realizations. Hudson River Power case, that is. One, the science developed and used in the case and associated impact analyses was eventually accepted in peer-reviewed scientific journals as state-of-the-art. This was a major step forward in advancing the science of impact assessment, as well as the scientific careers of technical experts on both sides in the case. Second, we still need robust science to inform us of the contribution of Hudson River fish species to coastal ecosystem dynamics, especially for the bay anchovy. We also still need to understand the effects of power plant-induced mortality on overall system productivity to find the signal through the noise, so to speak. Finally, in looking to the future of power plant development in the Hudson River watershed, including combined cycle and tidal energy generation and transmission from offshore wind farms, we need to determine how the development will affect productivity in the river proper, especially in light of anticipated climate change. And thank you. I think that's it for me.
Okay, thank you, John. So move on to Dan Miller. And just a little background on Dan Miller. He got his bachelor's of science from the University of New England and his master's in science and biology from Florida Atlantic University. He's currently the Estuary Habitat Restoration Coordinator for the New York DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program. His research and management focus is with local, state, and federal partners to identify, evaluate, and implement habitat restoration opportunities in the tidal portion of the Hudson, as well as the Hudson tributaries. He enjoys studying the cultural and ecological history of the Hudson River Valley, which can lead to sudden trips to a tidal marsh, abandoned factory, or other historic sites. So with that, Dan, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Miller. I'm the Habitat Restoration Coordinator for the Hudson River Estuary Program. Thank you for joining us this afternoon so we can talk a bit about some pretty drastic changes that occurred in the Hudson River Estuary between the mid-19th and early 20th century and the consequences of these changes for habitat loss and possible restoration in the future. So let's start with how we're going to identify habitats for this presentation. We're going to do so simply by depth. We'll start with the intertidal area, which is, many of you I'm sure are well aware, is the high tide line to the low tide line. This is the area of the river that is exposed at low tide, but it's submerged at high tide. It can be vegetated or unvegetated, sand or mud, and is usually found, along the edges of the river, where you would expect to find shallows and intertidal areas. The next is shallow water, which goes from the low tide line down to 6 feet deep. This has historically been known as the area where the limit of light penetration within the river. It's the littoral zone combined with the intertidal area. Again, we find vegetation within this area because light can penetrate to the bottom within this depth. And it's where we find the submerged aquatic vegetation or the rooted aquatic vegetation within the shallows of the river. Beyond 6 feet, we call deep water, and that's 6 feet to whatever, down to 180. And this is the zone in the water column where light does not penetrate. There is no aquatic vegetation that can be found, although there's plenty of other habitats that are utilized by the animals in the river. So let's begin by grouping the intertidal habitats and the shallow water habitats into what we call vegetated shallows or potentially vegetated shallows when we look back at the historic conditions. These habitats we know from today are really, really important to the health of the Hudson River and the overall condition of the ecosystem. Lots of biochemical processes happen here. There's lots of nutrient cycling. There is quite a bit of habitat complexity provided by the the plants themselves, and that complexity and productivity all add up to these habitats supporting a wide variety of plants and animals. The freshwater portion of the estuary to the north is also where a lot of these shallow areas tend to sort of dominate, and that has to do with the formation of the Hudson historically and the geology of New York State. So further to the south, you tend to have sort of a deeper, steep-sided, fjord-like river structure. There's not as much areas where there is naturally shallow waters. As you get further to the north, where the Mohawk is continuously pouring sand and sediment into the Hudson, and it falls out in this upper third of the estuaries, where you get quite a bit of shallow water, which is great for the habitat, but turns out was a problem for navigation. We'll get into that in just a moment. These vegetated shallows are really important habitats for fish, for many of the reasons that I just spoke of, both for resident fish, but also for the migratory fish that you see here. The striped bass and the American shad all spend portions of their life history in and around vegetated shallows, whether it's for spawning or for when post-yolk sac larvae become mobile and are able to seek refuge. They will do so in the vegetated portions of the river where they can feed and they can take refuge from predators and just sort of live off of all of that productivity for their first year before they then export out of the Hudson down and move offshore. So the really important habitat for the production of fishes in the estuary itself. Now, the deepwater habitats are very important too. I don't want to minimize them. There are a number of species of fish that are bottom-oriented and will go far beyond the penetration of light into the deepwater areas. The classic example for the Hudson is the Atlantic sturgeon. This is the crew out there tagging a number of years ago, and they like to one of their favorite fishing spots for collecting animals for tagging is the deep water off of Hyde Park. So certainly the sturgeon is one of the many species that utilize deep water areas in the Hudson. These deep water areas are also preferred by commerce and the large ships that find their way up and down the Hudson. This picture is taken off of Stockport Creek, and you can see in the foreground, this is at low tide, you can see the exposed mud flat and maybe some valve area laying down on it in there, not far from where this ship is passing through. Again, this is north of Catskill. This is in that somewhat shallow region, and this isn't really the way things were in the past. This is a result of the construction of a federal navigation channel up to Albany from New York City. So the big ships draw about 32 feet of water, or a little over 30 feet of water. So they need a lot of deep water habitat for them to pass. So the story of developing waterborne transportation on the Hudson really goes back to it goes back to the earliest times during the settlers, but developing it for commercial shipping goes back to the early and mid-19th century. This was a time when there was great optimism throughout the world that science and engineering was leading to a prosperous future where we could really kind of conquer nature and really sort of utilize the resources to our benefits as much as possible. And we were taking on huge projects all over the world, particularly in developing waterborne transportation. At that time, railroad systems weren't completely in place. There was certainly no air transportation and interstates and such. So waterborne commerce was the way to really most efficiently move material a long way. And globally, we had begun a lot of major canal projects to try to connect markets around the world. Examples of these are the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, which connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean, allowing there to be a flow of goods between Europe and Asia without having to go around the southern tip of Africa. The Panama Canal, which was completed in 1914 and started many years before that, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without having to go around the southern tip of South America. That right here in New York State, and that was the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825, connecting the Great Lakes and the Midwest to New York City via the Hudson River. The canal was a massive engineering feat on the scale of the Suez and the Panama Canal, often called the eighth wonder of the world, and remains a real historic landmark for the nation and for New York State today. So upon completion of the Erie Canal, you now have the Great Lakes and the Midwest connected to the international port in New York Harbor. And this system was all working very well, but it did have its bottlenecks and its problems. And that was the upper Hudson River estuary that was naturally shallow. We look at some old reports from the Army Corps of Engineers. This quote here is from 1888, referring to information that was gathered much earlier than that, where, as depicted in this map by Randall in 1890, they described the river as having too many channels. So essentially the river channel itself was very wide, and that accounted for the capacity for water to pass through. But the constant deposition of sand and shifting of sands and shoals in the river made it very difficult for navigation. And it was seen that the width of the river and its many channels through this braided river channel was an opportunity to provide a solution, and that would be to constrict the channel, to cut off flow to the side channels, and sort of narrow it so that the water would have to accelerate and self-scour. To give you an idea of just how shallow it was, in an earlier report, it's described, the reliable channel depth in the Hudson is described at 4.5 feet, meaning if you wanted to take a boat from Catskill all the way up to Albany, there were sections where if you did not want to run aground, your boat could not draw more than 4.5 feet deep. And if you compare that to the big ship that we saw earlier that draws 32 feet, there's quite a suggestion of some pretty radical change. So New York State and the federal government, starting about the 1930s, took on the project of trying to improve the reliability and the depth of the Hudson River Navigation Channel. All of these projects, particularly in the 1800s, were really focused around constricting the river channel to increase flow in the main channel, thereby increasing velocity and self-scour to deepen the river. This started with the construction of wing dikes on a number of these islands, from the tips of the islands to the shoreline, diverting the water into the main channel. That really didn't work all that well. So for about 30 years in the middle of the 1800s, New York State and the federal government constructed a series of longitudinal dikes that were in the main river, running north to south, that really squeezed down that main channel as much as possible, again trying to constrict it and increase velocity. There's a picture of one of those dikes here on the left, which cut off the main channel from shallow water areas on the landward side. That, along with some minor dredging, was somewhat successful. They were able to achieve a 7.5 foot reliable depth of the channel, but there was need for larger capacity and bigger boats. So in a series of actions between 1910 and the 1950s, the channel was dredged and deepened from about 12 feet to 27, and then again to its current depth of 32 feet. That produced a tremendous amount of dredge spoil, which was then side cast into these shallow areas on the other side of the longitudinal dikes, thereby filling in a tremendous amount of shallow habitats and intertidal habitats. This picture here is of Gaze Point. This area, the white that you see there is all freshly deposited dredge spoil. This area on our historic maps it is depicted as all shallow open water habitats. So, potentially vegetated, potentially important habitat for fish is now Dredge Spoil Island. So the question is, what was the impact on habitat beyond just the changing shape of the river for fishes and such? And a big part of that is understanding whether or not there was a lot of vegetation there. And there's hints of that in a number of sources out there. One of them is this book by Benson Lossing that Karen referred to in her talk last week, that describes an area off of Castleton. And it describes the appearance of tall-masted sloops passing through vast meadows, the water that bears them not being visible. So certainly that suggests pretty dense, pretty thick vegetation within the river channel in the shallow areas, so much so that the sloops that are passing by appear to be floating on vegetation rather than water. So suggestive, at least, of quite a bit of vegetated area that was likely very good habitat. That, in contrast to this air photo that was taken as part of our submerged aquatic vegetation inventories at the DEC, that's Castleton, that populated area on the right. In this section, rather than looking like the description you see on the left, it is a narrow, deep river channel, some small shallows along the edges, but a far cry from the description that you see on the left. So to get a better idea of actually how much, or quantifying how much habitat or shallow water was lost during this effort, we were able to utilize some old maps that were produced by the Army Corps of Engineers between 1890 and 1907. They went out and surveyed the Hudson prior to major navigational improvement and dredging, and came up with these very accurate maps that have a ton of information, and they're really, really interesting to study. The important thing to remember with these, though, is that this is not the historic condition. Plenty of things had already been done at this point to try to improve navigation. Those longitudinal dikes I had talked about were already in place. The wing dikes were in place, but it was prior to the large-scale dredging and filling that occurred that impacted so much of the Hudson. The large map that you see across the top is about 13 feet long. Actually, it's 9 feet, sorry. It's about 9 feet long. It depicts the Hudson from Troy all the way down to Athens. It has a wealth of information, including channel cross-sections and channel profiles and depth profiles along the length of the map, points of land and such, tremendous amount of information. So that map was digitized, but we also found these other maps that were part of the same series, but they were of a smaller scale. So they covered a smaller area with greater detail. And you can see this map, one of these examples of an area that's the same Skodak Island, Hoteling Island area that we saw earlier in the Randall map. And you can see it's kind of hard to see here, but those sort of blurred lines that you see going across the river, those are all depth soundings. And so all of those locations and values were digitized, along with the shorelines and the islands and the dikes along the length of the river. We were able to take that information from those maps and digitize it. So this is us sort of tracing the shoreline, the islands, and the longitudinal dikes in GIS. So these are more than just lines. These are actual polygons and polylines that were created from the maps themselves. This is the process of doing that. And once we have that information, then we can take that data and we can do a modern day photograph, air photo, that is also georeferenced. So what you're seeing here is the historic information taken from those old Army Corps maps and then placed on top of this area, which is Shad Island. It's just north of the I-90 spur that crosses just south of Castleton, which is off to the left here. And what you're seeing is in orange are the historic islands. The red is the historic shoreline. and anywhere in between the shoreline that is not island but is now land is areas that were filled, and that's just this portion of the river. We took that image then and went to Cornell, and Nordica Holichuk helped us, put us in contact with a student there, Brian Chan, who simply replicated the image of water over the areas that we identified as fill, so that we could get this sort of plan form look of what the river looked like. So this is rooted in actual data for this section of the river. It tells you where there was water and where there was land. What it doesn't tell you is how deep it was and whether or not it was vegetated. But this is a good look of what the river may have looked like from the air back in 1907. We can then take that, and then simply using a transition animation, I can show you 100 years of filling in 5 seconds. So let's give that a try. And there you go. So that's a very typical section of this portion of the river, where you can see how the overall river channel complex is restricted down to this straight and fairly narrow river, and you can only imagine the consequences it had for habitat. As for depths, though, using those depth soundings, we can, and using modern day bathymetry, we can look at those habitat types on those 3 habitat categories that I identified earlier. And what you're looking at here is the intertidal marsh in the light green. The darker green is shallow water, and then the darkest is the deep water. And what this is showing is an overall loss of river area, water area, of about 3,000 acres, right? And this is area that was filled. So material was taken from the bottom of the river, and we filled in shallows and marshes and intertidal areas. So we've lost 3,000 acres of habitat. But it also shows that there is a gain in deep water, and there's a subsequent loss of shallow water because, not because it was filled, but because shallow water was deepened and dug up. So overall, the loss of shallow and intertidal habitat amounts to over 4,000 acres lost of this critical habitat that supports fish in the river. When I look at this, I look at historically a system throughout this area that was dominated by this littoral region, right? So this potentially vegetated shallow area was a pretty good majority of the total habitat available within that system. Today, when you look at it, the majority of the habitat is deep water. So there's been a fundamental shift in the ratio of those habitats, and then therefore a fundamental shift in their sort of contribution, relative contributions to the condition of the river as it is today. So this is my own version of a fisheries management equation showing our hope to increase the population in the future. And that is, you take the population of present day and you try to increase recruitment, which is a function of both mortality, which we try to manage through fishing seasons and size limits and gear restrictions, but also a big part of that is also trying to get the Hudson to produce more fish in order to increase recruitment. And the role of these habitats in not only as spawning habitats, but as habitat for juveniles and smaller fish before they mature and head out to sea is an important part of trying to increase that overall recruitment. All this information is summarized in the Hudson River Estuary Habitat Restoration Plan, which was produced in 2012. It also summarizes, or at least identifies, the 4 main habitat types that will be priorities moving forward for habitat restoration in the Hudson, and it covers just about all of them: shallow waters, shorelines, intertidal areas, and tributaries. These are the areas that were most impacted by human action in the past. It has become the basis for a number of planning efforts that have occurred after that, including planning efforts by local partners and also the federal government. So the good news is that we've actually started doing some side channel and shallow water restoration on the Hudson. This is the Gaze Point side channel restoration, which was completed in the fall of 2017. The project was supported by the New York State Bridge Authority mitigation money for the construction of the Mario M. Cuomo Bridge. Brian DeGasperis for DEC was the DEC point person on managing the project. And what was done here was that area to the right is that Gaze Point Peninsula, which was entirely dredge spoil. So this isn't a restoration of what was historically a side channel, but we created one here by making a cut through the end of the peninsula in the hopes of increasing the exchange of water through that into that back channel back there with the to the area, wetland area to the north of the bottom of the picture here, hoping to improve habitat, not only where this side channel was cut, but also improving exchange and improving fish habitat to the north and to the south. As we look ahead to more restoration opportunities, the things we have going for us and the challenges are pretty typical with any type of project like this. Whether or not you have the funding can be a challenge or an opportunity. Your partnerships that you create lots of opportunities. The thing I want to focus on the most, though, is our biggest challenge to all of these projects is now property ownership. Much of these areas that were filled were granted to private property owners and are now in private ownership. So convincing property owners that going in and doing habitat restoration, taking their forested areas and turning them into aquatic areas can be complicated for property owners and difficult to convince them that it's the right thing to do. And we can't move forward without their support. And in many cases, they just may not see the value in it. We have seen cases where we have property owners who really believe themselves to be good stewards of the land, and for every reasonable assessment of what they do, there are good stewards of the land, and they just don't agree that going in and digging it up and putting a side channel is something that's worth doing. So that's going to be one of our biggest challenges, is actually finding opportunities where the property owner, be them a private property owner or a public municipal property owner, will allow us to come in and do this type of work. So that's all I have today. I'd like to thank Chuck Nieder and Jim Lodge and the Hudson River Environmental Society and the Hudson River Foundation for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'll make myself available for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So we're going to move on to George Jackman. Dr. Jackman is actually a retired New York Police Department lieutenant turned aquatic ecologist. So he now has a PhD in ecology that he earned from Cooney Graduate Center. Currently, he holds an adjunct professorship at Queens College, and he's the senior habitat restoration manager at Hudson River Foundation. Hudson River Riverkeeper. His research focuses on migratory fish and impacts of fish barriers. So he is an advocate for removing dams in the Hudson Valley to restore migratory fish ranges throughout the Hudson River watershed. So without further ado, I'll give it over to Lieutenant Dr. Jackman.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank the Hudson River Foundation for inviting me to speak, and the DEC for being a wonderful partner. And I'm trying to share my screen right now. Here we go. And so today I'm going to talk about dam removal and habitat restoration in the Hudson Valley. And what we've been doing is trying to create fish passage on the tributaries, and mostly for river herring and eels, but not just them. You know, we also want to improve habitat for freshwater mussels and other macroinvertebrates and native species that live in these tributaries. If we look at I call it the Jamawissa Creek, that's the former name of Furnace Brook in Westchester County. And we hope going forward to change the name back to the Algonquin name of Jamawissa Creek. And we broke up, there was a dam that breached in 1999 after Hurricane Floyd, and there was some rubble left in the stream. And in partnership with the SCA, we started clearing that channel. And last fall, we planted some trees in the former McKinney Pond. I now call it the McKinney Forest, and we're going to be planting trees there this spring. So we've been working with the DEC and local municipalities to restore habitat. And I want to start with the beginning. You know, we, at the contact, when the Half Moon sailed up the Hudson River, Robert Jewett, the navigator, remarked, "The river is full of fish." And he was on board the Half Moon. He was also a mutineer later on that sent Henry Hudson and his son adrift in Hudson's Bay, and they were never found. But 400 years later, every iconic Hudson River fish is either in decline, imperiled, or endangered. And so we have to do something different. A lot of that, you know, in the 1880s was when they started to discover that fisheries were in decline. And a lot of it, these were haul seines that just netted, you know, massive amounts of shad and river herring. And and this is industrial fishing today. You know, in the bottom picture on the right hand is, it's, you know, 8,000 pounds of fish in that net. And, you know, it's an extraordinary amount of fish that can be hauled up. And so today, what we're looking at, the dams on the Hudson River, half the tributaries are dammed by natural falls. And then as the settlement in the Hudson Valley started, you know, it was centered around water for power. It started with grist mills. If you wanted a sawmill, you needed power. There was no Con Ed at the time. And then it moved to industrial power. And we are left with a lot of these dams. These are now obsolete mill dams that are clogging a lot of our rivers. So we're in a crisis point today. Freshwater dependent organisms are now the most imperiled group of species on the planet. Is that new news? Not quite. However, you know, if we look at freshwater mussels, one of our own, Dave Strayer et al., said it's the most imperiled of all organisms in North America. And there was just a recent report in the World Wildlife Fund just released. It says migratory fish have declined by 76% in the last 50 years. This was Burkhead et al. You know, this is, you know, for those of us who are in the field, this is nothing new. We've known that, you know, freshwater organisms are in decline and that they have the highest extinction rate in the world. And the background, the rate is 900 times greater than the background extinction rate for freshwater fishes. And another report said freshwater fishes have declined 84% in the past 50 years. We're at a crisis. It's a calamity what we're at right now. It's one of the largest problems facing, what I think, facing the world that we need to do something about. So dam removal is an option that Riverkeeper has engaged. The DEC has been an effective partner with us in this project. We're trying to open up habitat for American eels and river herring. These are, you know, diadromous fishes, but you know, resident fishes also benefit, like a petadromous fish like this white sucker. Though it's not in decline, resident species will benefit too. And not only that, the water quality will benefit. This was the only good news in all of this is this recent report was picked up by NBC News in February. And it said half the world's 80 freshwater species, which make up half the world's species, have been declared extinct. And 16 disappeared in 2020 alone. There's nothing good about that. But the only good news coming from it is that it's becoming mainstream. It's not just esoterica that aquatic ecologists are aware of. It's now that this is a growing crisis. Why is that important? Well, freshwater fishes are the sentinels of the problems that our rivers are facing. And as they decline, they're the canaries in the coal mines. And, you know, this Walsh et al. Says the loss of biodiversity on planet Earth is probably one of the greatest impending environmental crises facing humanity today. So what to do about it? Well, the first thing we can do in the Hudson Valley, there's 1,600 dams. And so Riverkeeper and our municipal partners and DEC, we've decided to try and do what we can and establish the wherewithal to remove the dams. Why? Well, we know that dams impair the chemical and thermal properties of the river. They cause increased evaporation. They release greenhouse gases. They block the flow of water and sediment and alter natural flow regimes. And what you lose is connection to the floodplains. But worse than all that is each dam is a violent impact to the river, and it represents an ecological reset point from the river. A river flows in a continuum from its headwaters to its confluence. Once you stop that, you have to restart it at each dam. So the water and the sediment restarts downhill. So the only way I can equate it, it's like taking a loan on your 401k, you know, every couple of years and wondering when it's time to retire, where's the money? Well, the same thing is happening here. Where's the nutrients? Where's the connection that the fish need? And aside from all that, it creates blockages for fish and it creates a loss of genetic diversity. So the primary problem with dams is the primary impact is they fragment habitat and they cause an ecological interruption. But here you can see this is upstream and downstream of a dam in the Hudson Valley. I took these pictures. Actually, this summer I went and took a picture of the impoundment and it's just green murk. And it's the same stream, but notice the difference in water quality. What is coming downstream and then what is below the dam is changed. And this is what you see in the impoundments when there's nutrient flow and then you change a lotic system into a lentic system, or really what you do is convert flowing water into an impoundment. You facilitate the growth of harmful algal blooms. I have other greater pictures, but this one kind of gets the point. There's a lot of duckweed in there mixed within, there's algal blooms. But another problem is a sediment-starved river starts to scour downstream, and it's going to re-pick up the sediment that it lost, and it's going to start scouring the substrate, and it's going to scour the riverbanks. In 2016 was a monumental event. Riverkeeper partnered with the DEC and the city of Troy to remove this barrier. This barrier accidentally fell when they were testing it to look at it. For 85 years, it blocked the passage of river herring into the Winans Kill from the Hudson River. So this was the first time the Hudson Valley that a tributary was restored expressly for fish passage. So what happened was 4 days after that removal of that barrier, river herring moved into the trib to spawn. And that was a watershed event, literally. It was at that point that Riverkeeper decided to engage in the dam removal campaign, and I became a member of the Riverkeeper team. This is the Struxfeld Dam. This was on the Quasaya Creek. For 300 years, a dam of some iteration has stood in place here in this location and has blocked the river, and some iteration of it. This dam was removed in partnership with Newburgh, the city of Newburgh, Orange County, New York State DEC, Princeton Hydro, River Logic, and Riverkeeper. But as you can see, this is one of the remnant dams. And this was a 200-year-old structure that existed prior to this construction of this dam. So for 300 years, this river has been blocked to fish. That's the primary barrier. This is now what that river looks like with the dam removed. It was a very difficult process to get this dam removed. And again, a part of the success of a dam removal is overcoming the arduous permitting process that's involved with removing a dam. And from the time we got an agreement to remove this dam from Newburgh and Orange County, the permitting process was complicated by COVID. And we finally went through all the hurdles by Army Corps of Engineers, NIMS, US Fish and Wildlife, the local, then DEC. And then it was a week before we were ready to move our equipment in, Newburgh says, we don't have a buildings permit. So we had to scramble a week before that. So I can assure you, getting this dam down was a triumph. And so this was the second dam removed for fish passage on a Hudson River tributary. This is another dam. Again, the Jamawissa Creek is also known as Furnace Brook. The Furnace Brook was called Furnace Brook. It made cannonballs during the Revolutionary War. This was a small dam that this was the first barrier. Actually, it was the second barrier. The first barrier, Maiden Lane Lower Dam, breached during a hurricane, and this now became the first barrier. This was another arduous permitting process. You know, this is a small dam, 4 or 5 feet, and is really just a construction debris from another era. Well, that's what we are removing. And so removal of a low-head dam doesn't really involve much. There was very little sediment behind this, this dam or the one on the Quasaya Creek. The amount of disturbance to the creek was not much different than routine maintenance for a bridge or a culvert. This dam was removed in partnership with Westchester County, the DEC provide the funding, Princeton Hydro, the engineering, and River Logic and Riverkeeper. So for these low-head dams, New York City needs to streamline the removal process to facilitate an easier removal process, and we could get these things out of the way because they really are just construction debris that serve no legitimate purpose anymore. This is what the Jamawissa Creek looks like without a dam. We created this kind of side channel and we left that little happy tree there. Bob Ross would have been proud of that tree. He always talked about a happy tree. So for the low-head dams, what we're trying to do is convince people that low-head dams, barring glaring issues, it should be a more streamlined process. And as long as there's not toxic sediment or large amounts of sediment, then it should be an easy process. We got to decide what is best for the creek and the organisms that are residents of these creeks, or use it for their life cycle. So here we move on to historic dams. Historic dams require creative solutions. Here's a dam in the Hudson Valley. We have an agreement to remove this dam, and we have received funding from the DEC to potentially look at removing this dam, but it's been deemed historic. So that really complicates our removal efforts. But there's also creative solutions. This is the historic Kent Dam on the Cuyahoga River. This was deemed historic too. But if you can notice, what they did was they created a fountain on the dam, made a park behind it, and created a bypass channel. Everybody's happy. Why can't we do this in the Hudson Valley when we come across this stone structure? I question, what is historic? Would we ask the Native Americans and ask, is this dam historic? For a 40 million year old fish like America's only catadromous fish that's in deep decline, is this fish historic? Or depleted river herring historic? Is the landscape historic? How about a free-flowing river? Does it have rights? Is it historic? Or do the organisms that need that river to survive and flourish, is that historic? Well, we need to adjust what history is. History needs to be all-inclusive, not just seen from a sacrosanct European perspective. I visited Plymouth, Massachusetts, and arguably this is one of the most historic towns in the United States. This is the town Brook, or town Brook. And on this, they also had historic dams. As a matter of fact, there were quite a few of them. But it was on the town Brook that the Wampanoags taught the Pilgrims how to fish and how to take those river herring and put it into their three sisters to fertilize them. There were 6 historic dams removed on town Brook to restore the migratory fishes. As you can see this sign, it was built to improve they were removed to improve the ecology of town Brook. They removed a 220-year-old dam that obstructed fish passage. They felt that the benefit to restoring fisheries was the greatest good. A lot of times I hear, why not put a fishway? Why not put a fishway on it? Well, not all fish can climb, and not all people can climb these cables either. I'm sure if I took a section of the population and I asked them to climb these cables, you wouldn't have robust individuals like these cops, emergency service cops, or these MTA police climbing the rigging. I can assure, and make it even worse, make them as pregnant females to climb that. That's what we're asking fish to do. Then here's the other problem. What is the mortality of fish falling from the waters from the spillway into the turbulent waters? I was asked, why don't we put a fishway on this? Because downstream passage is essential when moving fish upstream. So you're going to toss a fish down here. How are they going to escape that system? Fishways are failing or have failed because they overlooked the emigration of post-spawn adults and juveniles. There's very, very few studies on this. You look at a river herring wrong, they lose their scales. They die of fright. They have deciduous scales. You toss them in there, they're going to be churned around in that hydraulic recirculation, especially juveniles. And then they're going to be, there will be indirect mortality, which would make them susceptible to shock and then predation. And here's the other problem with the fishway. Are we sending fish into an ecological trap? We're sending them into a lentic system filled with predators. This is a Hudson River tributary. As you notice, look at this. This was a giant largemouth bass I saw when I donned some equipment to look at the herring and the bass. And my question is, are the centrarchids the feral cats of our waterways? Do their juveniles stand a chance, or do their offspring stand a chance with black bass, sunfish, and other creatures? Are we losing the recruitment? Well, according to Abel et al. 2020, there are a lot of species, and Maddock et al. 2016, a lot of our ambush predators. And then speaking to various people from NOAA, they agree that there's a lot of ambush predators in these systems. Here's another problem. These are non-natives that entered the Hudson River in 1830 after a hurricane. They were imported from Germany for food. In Europe, they eat them. I've never eaten, I think I ate a carp once. I'll never eat one again, I can assure you. But are they feasting on the herring caviar? These fish would easily gobble up those eggs. Here's another problem with the fishway. I was asked, why don't we put a fishway on this dam? You want to put a fishway on a dam that's collapsing? Before we went through that permitting process. Because the problem with putting a fishway, you often have to rebuild the dam. Then we extend the life of that dam by another 75 years. I'd rather remove that dam. This is an obsolete dam that's crumbling, that it's on its way out, and we're going to push it. We're going to remove that and make a fish passage. A free-flowing stream requires no maintenance whatsoever. A fishway requires a lot of maintenance. During COVID, we saw a lot of rivers didn't pass fish. Here's another problem I hear about on the Hudson River tributaries. Microhydro, small, there's very little efficiency coming from these hydropower dams, but there are large ecological impacts. We have to look at what's the power versus the ecological impact. This in particular dam, has a FERC exemption. It doesn't need turbines on it, though I've been working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the owners to try and get turbines on this, because there are eels in the system, and the emigrating eels during the autumn as the silver eels will try and head back to the Sargasso Sea, and most of the time they're going to look for a low-level outlet. And if they look for a low-level outlet, they're going to swim right into the machinery, they're going to be entrained by the turbines. They're either going to be mangled or they're going to be dropped from bedrock. So you're going to take a fish, drop it 10, 12 feet onto this bedrock. What happens to the fish? We're injuring. They're about to run a marathon, and then we toss them either over this or we send them through the turbines. But I've often heard, but it's only a run-of-river dam for a hydropower. Run-of-river means this is a run-of-river dam. Water in equals water out, or water falls over the spillway. Run-of-river is not a euphemism for something good. So we know that freshwater fish populations are collapsing. 1/3 are threatened with extinction due to pollution, habitat alteration, and dams. We need to think hard about the impact of hydropower dams on our tributaries. This is what happens to eels when they swim through turbines, hydropower turbines. We need to think of the consequences. Our eel populations are collapsing. This is often another thing that needs to be considered. Oftentimes I hear, what happens after we remove that dam? This is going to be a mud pit. Oh, it's going to be awful. And there's going to be filled with invasives. Well, I can assure you not. In this situation, here's a dam that breached naturally. Within 30 days, that mud pit vegetated itself. And this is what it starts to look like. And then it grows and found its own channel. And then we decided to help it along with the Trees for Trib program. And we planted 200 trees. We got another 200 trees coming this spring. This was McKinney Pond. I now call it the McKinney Forest. And the owners are grateful that we're working with them to restore their land ever since. Well, they also found out to repair that dam would cost them $1.2 million. So they said, let's get rid of it. Anyway, I love this quote. This is why we plant trees. It's not for me. That McKinney Forest will be mature and I'll be long gone. But I'll tell you what, it is one of the greatest ways to change the world and to actually take part in changing the world is by planting a tree. In addition, the removal of dam mitigation during a climate crisis provides a storage capacity the way these rivers were designed. When you drop the dam, you also lower the water levels and you allow the former impoundments to be used as flood storage. And you also allow the river to reconnect with its floodplains on a seasonal basis. This is on the same stream. These are my favorite dams. I heard at a public forum, somebody said, these things are just like human dams. Are you kidding me? That thing is porous to eels and fishes. As a matter of fact, I went to visit this same dam after our winter freshet. We had a freshet, or like, we had a rainstorm, an intense rainstorm in December. Well, this is what it looked like right after. The whole dam was blown out. So anybody who compares a concrete dam to a beaver dam, you're seriously mistaken. This thing allows reconnection. We have some other dams slated for removal. Westchester County has set aside to remove the money to remove the Maiden Lane Dam. That's going to be a large project. I also have an agreement to remove this dam. Westchester County is becoming a vanguard in this movement, and some of these people in there, I don't want to name names, but my God, they're pushing, and they are now championing the removal of dams. I believe there's about 7 dams that are going to be coming down in Westchester County. They are doing a bodacious job, and I am glad to be working with them. And this one, we hope that we just need to find the money to remove that. And I love this quote by Thoreau: "In wildness is the salvation of the world." That's about all I have today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, George. So I'm going to introduce Heather now. So Heather Giloff, she received her graduate degree from SUNY ESF, and she's currently the habitat manager in both regions 3 and 4 for DEC. It means most of the Hudson River Estuary north of the harbor, and she reviews large projects that may have an impact on the Hudson River or Long Island Sound in both regions 3 and 4. She's the manager of the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve, and which is a system of 29 national estuarine research reserves located around the country, run by NOAA. So she's managing it's a program that's run by New York State DEC and in partnership with NOAA. Her research focus, she works with partners to implement research focus areas that have been identified by the reserve recently in an event that was held in March 2020 at Norrie Point. And so without further ado, Heather, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chuck. And I appreciate the invitation to come today. So I'm going to present on the stressors that we know are coming our way on the Hudson. And I'm going to focus in on power generation, power transmission, storm surge barrier proposals, anchorages, mostly on the projects that we have in the regulatory process or have been available for public comment. I'm quite sure there's a lot of projects that I'm not going to touch on. And today I hope that I give enough detail to the attendees to have a better understanding of the projects and how they may impact the Hudson as they go forward. Okay, I'm going to start with power generation. New York State, through the Climate Act, has committed to having renewable energy make up 70% of the energy delivered to New York by 2030. It's a pretty ambitious goal, and most of the generation investment has been focused on offshore wind and tidal generation pilot projects. And New York has a goal of producing 9,000 megawatts of power supplied by offshore wind by 2035. And New York State Energy Research Development Authority just announced investment in 2 Equinor wind farms, Equinor Wind Farm number 2 and Beacon Wind. And this adds to the 2018 announcement supporting Empire Wind 1 and Sunrise Wind. Offshore wind farms are in the ocean, significantly off the coast of New York. In fact, the Equinor wind farms that were just announced are approximately 20 miles off the shores of Long Island. There's also pilot projects investigating the ability to produce energy using tidal waters in the East River. Those are including the Roosevelt Island and Gmax Force energy projects. Offshore wind turbines produce energy that are transmitted down to the converter station on land using cables buried below the water body. So once the converter station, once the cable reaches the converter station, it is then distributed in the upland using the transmission network. Yet the Hudson River may be directly impacted by these cable routes because the cables had to find their way from the wind farms to the substations in New York City and Long Island. The routes, as far as I can tell, are still in the working through the regulatory process and haven't been finalized, but we can anticipate multiple routes off the shores of Long Island and in the harbor. In addition to moving cable on land, there's a push to move construction of the wind turbine elements from Europe to the East Coast and New York. The New York offshore wind projects are going to include several port improvements for construction and installation, including the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, Port Jefferson Harbor, Montauk Harbor, Port of Albany, and Port of Coymans. The Port of Albany and Port of Coyman improvements are proposed to increase capability to construct elements of the wind turbines in New York. And what you have pictured here on top is an artistic rendition of Port of Albany. This is an area at the port that's not currently built, so the buildings, the shoreline, the staging, and the terminal will need to be constructed to establish a tower manufacturing facility. The Capital District is known for short-nosed sturgeon spawning area as a short-nosed sturgeon spawning area, and there'll have to be careful consideration in dredging the area in front of the Port of Albany to facilitate the movement of ships into the area. The bottom picture is an artistic rendition of gravity bases moving down the Hudson River from the Port of Coymans. So in their proposal, in Equinor's proposal, they're proposing to improve Coymans to actually construct those bases at Coymans. They'll make their way back down to the river to a staging port, likely the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. As I said, they're exploring the using of tidal waters to produce energy. The first project is the Roosevelt Island Tidal Energy Project. The initial demonstration of this project was installed in 2008 in the East River. It was deemed successful and had been removed and approved upon and just recently reinstalled in October of 2020 as a FERC pilot project. As you can see, the turbines that are pictured here are similar to offshore wind. So they're mounted on tubular steel tri-frames, and those tri-frames are rested on the river bottom. But the movement of those turbines, you can imagine, caused concern for the East River and for the species using the East River. So because of these concerns and the potential impacts, there's a number of monitoring programs associated with this project, including monitoring threatened endangered species, birds, fish, underwater noise, and impacts to recreation. The underwater turbine will produce energy when the water velocity exceeds 2 knots. So in this chart, you'll see that that area is in orange, and each of those orange areas are approximately 4.5 hours of time. The second tidal energy project is the Gmax Tidal Energy Project. It's similar to the Roosevelt Island project because it is proposed for the East River. It produces energy when the water is moving at least 2 knots. And in this case, it's using engines. And those engines are mounted on the barge rather than permanently installed in the bottom of the river. The Gmax Tidal Energy Project has not been installed yet. It is in the regulatory process. There's a lot of different types of power generation, and certainly they all seem to have a potential to impact fish species. Burying of cables potentially will disturb the very bottom of those water bodies and disturb the way the fish move in that construction area. The electrified cables may emit electromagnetic fields, increase temperatures. And of course, those wind farms seem like they would certainly change the way the fish move in that area off into the ocean, and certainly may impact the way that fish migrate into the Hudson. And the ports that are improved to facilitate offshore wind construction will require deepening and improvement, and if done without careful design and consideration, may have an impact onto the bottom of the river and impact short-nosed sturgeon spawning areas. And of course, seeing those engines and turbines underneath the East River, it's easy to assume that there's a potential there for direct fish mortality, and certainly a possibility of the way that fish move in the East River will be influenced by those two projects. I've touched on power transmission, but during a recent study by NYSERDA, it's determined that all of the offshore wind, the tidal projects, and all the renewable energy projects in the New York City vicinity will not meet the demand. So New York is looking to build capacity to generate renewable energy upstate, and there's going to be a need to move that energy through an efficient transmission system capable of delivering that energy downstate. There's two projects. The Champlain Hudson Power Express received its New York State Power Service Commission certificate in April of 2013, and the Empire State Connector is in the preliminary stages in the regulatory process. So the Champlain Hudson Power Express is a privately funded transmission project that's proposing to move hydropower from Canada down to New York City using a direct current power cable buried. And the project has been issued that certificate, and it has not been constructed at this point, but it's proposed to be 333 miles, with approximately 60% of those area buried under the water bodies. In New York, in Upper New York and Northern New York, it would be buried in Lake Champlain, and then it'll work its way down through the Hudson and the Harlem and East Rivers. In the Hudson, the cable, the two 5-inch diameter cables, will be installed using a jet plow, and that jet plow will shoot a stream of water in the bottom of that river, causing the bottom sediment to be released into the water column, and that creates a trench. And that trench will then have the cables laid down in, and as the construction moves forward, the sediment will eventually settle back into the construction area. In the majority of the river, the trench is proposed to be at least 6 feet deep, and where that cable is crossing the navigational channel, that trench is going to be at least 15 feet deep. During the regulatory process in 2012, there was a number of models run, and during that planning process, it was expected that there will be negligible thermal and electromagnetic field impacts with the installation of this cable. But of course, New York State has still concerns about this project, especially with the amount of cabling underneath the Hudson. And because of this, the certificate requires monitoring, mitigation, and the establishment of the Champlain Hudson Power Express Governance Committee. And the monitoring is going to include assessing Atlantic sturgeon movement, pre and post energizing, monitoring the bathymetry, pre and post energizing, recovering sediment, measuring the water temperature, and measuring the electromagnetic field around that cable. And during construction, the water quality and total suspended solids will be monitored, and there's already an agreed upon threshold in the certificate, so that as the construction moves forward, if those bounds are reaching close to it, that construction will have to stall out and reassess its method. The second project is called the Empire State Connector. This also is a privately funded transmission project. It's proposed to collect renewable energy from upstate New York at the Utica substation. At this point, the Empire State Connector is still working through the regulatory process, but it is proposing to move at least 1,000 megawatts of power down 265 miles south to New York City. Because it's still in the regulatory process, the final route hasn't been determined, but I think it's reasonable to expect the route will be in both the upland and under the water, in the Mohawk and in the Hudson valleys. Of course, that type of construction has potential to impact fish species. I've mentioned some of them, but will the installation of the cable influence fish movement during construction and after? That cable that's going to be going down with the Champlain Hudson Power Express, there'll be sections of that cable that will be insulated with concrete mats. And so the question might be, as the sediment settles down into that construction area, will it settle back in the correct place? How long will that benthic area take to recover? And then will there be an increase in temperature? Will the cable emit electromagnetic fields similar to what's modeled? Those are all questions, and of course, that's the reason why many of those elements are being monitored and required in the certificate condition. So another stressor that we know is a potential are storm surge barriers. Coastal storms have severely impacted the North Atlantic coast, and those impacts prompted the Army Corps to investigate measures to manage future flood risk. And in that investigation into the North Atlantic coast, one of the 9 areas identified was the New York, New Jersey harbor region. Many will likely remember those pictures of New York City and New Jersey during and after Superstorm Sandy. They were very impactful. And this prompted the Harbor and Tributaries Focus Area Feasibility Study. And Army Corps is working with non-federal partners, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation with New York City, and New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And the study is assessing the current modeling. The project proposals came up with 6 alternatives that were presented to the public for further comments. Okay, there are 6 alternatives. Alternative 1 is not pictured here because that is a zero action alternative. In addition, there's an alternative 5, which only includes shoreline solutions. So it's not pictured here because it spans not just this area, but all the way up into the upper reaches of the Hudson. But the 4 left in front of you, alternatives 2, 3A, 3B, and 4, all include storm surge barriers and natural and nature-based features and non-structural measures. A storm surge barrier is designed to close and prevent a surge to moving up into the New York and Jersey harbor area. The storm event and water level that would prompt the barrier to be closed is a key element to the design, but is not determined during the feasibility study. And many may remember alternative 2 because this is the largest barrier that was proposed, and it was to go between Sandy Hook and Breezy Point. But the update in April of 2020 was that the harbor and tributary study was put on hold because it wasn't included in the 2020 Army Corps fiscal funding. I think it's still valuable to think about storm surge barriers and their potential to impact, because as our storm events become more intense, we may decide, or people may decide, that barriers are a tool to use when mitigating flood risk. But I don't think you can really truly understand what a storm surge barrier could impact the waterway unless we learn a little bit more about what a storm surge barrier is. So I just want to go over that. And what you see in front of you are 2 artistic renditions of the storm surge barrier that was proposed near the Verrazano Bridge in alternative 3A. The picture on the left, you can see that there are 2 islands with 2 very large gates. In addition, on the right, you can see that each island has gates on either side of them. And in these pictures, both of these gates are open. But you can see even with those gates being open, there's significant physical structure permanently in the water body. Now, once those gates close, it certainly will change the way the water moves, and how often those gates close and for how long will also have an impact onto the water body. And of course, that's something that would be designed further down the line and was not decided on or thought about because the feasibility has not moved forward. So how might storm surge barriers impact the Hudson? Well, you can see here with this depiction from Army Corps that the harbor is a really complex system. It has lots of interaction between the tributaries, the ocean, and the harbor. So putting barriers in the system certainly has the ability to have direct fish impacts, being a barrier to free fish movement, but also the secondary impacts. Those structures may change how sediment moves in the area. It certainly will influence the way the water flows, even at times when the gates are open. Okay, I'm going to spend a bit more time now on anchorages. This is the last stressor I'm going to present on today, hopefully leaving some time for questions and answers. So anchorages are areas that provide locations that a vessel can anchor due to weather, visibility, sea conditions, port conditions, and other hazardous circumstances that a vessel may be experiencing. Currently, we have 2 anchorages on the Hudson, one in the Yonkers and one in Hyde Park. Several mariner organizations reached out to the Coast Guard because they had concerns with the safety navigating the Hudson River. And in response, the Coast Guard in 2016, June of 2016, published an advance notice to public rulemaking seeking comments on the contemplation of 10 official anchorages. Well, as you may know, the advance notice was an extra step in seeking public input. And of course, there was a lot of public input. There was over 10,000 comments received, and many were not supportive. And they had concerns with vessel traffic, increasing vessel traffic, impacts to vistas. The concern was that the vessels would block scenic vistas, and also the impacts to fish habitat. Actually, just recently, in January of 2021, the Elijah Cummings Coast Guard Authorization Act was signed into law, and this act required that the Coast Guard suspend the establishment of the anchorages and requires the Coast Guard commander to work with the Hudson River Safety, Navigation, and Operations Committee to conduct a study of the Hudson River. And that study is to examine the nature of the vessel traffic on the Hudson, the risk and benefit of anchoring, as well as the risk and benefit to establishing anchorages. So you may be wondering, how would an anchorage impact fish species? Well, when an anchor is deployed, it digs down to the bottom of the river and can dig a trench that is 6 feet deep, 9 feet wide, and can be as long as 1,000 linear feet. Pictured on the right is imagery taken from the Hyde Park Anchorage area. These lines that you're seeing, although I imagine it might be a little bit difficult, but you can see these lines, and these are lines of the scarring, and that scarring can persist for more than a year. Something that you may not be able to see because the text is probably a bit blurry, there's also identified Atlantic sturgeon that are obviously swimming around while the imagery was being taken. And that's because the Hyde Park Anchorage is in close proximity to the most important known Atlantic sturgeon spawning area in the Hudson River. So as we move forward with processing an assessment on anchorages on the Hudson, it's going to be really important that we strategize how those anchorages are designed and taking careful consideration of the bottom habitat and how that's being used. Well, that's all I have for today. And again, if you have any questions, my name is Heather Giloff, manager of the marine habitat for both regions 3 and 4, as well as the manager of the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Heather. And thank you to all of our speakers. And so we got several questions, and so we'll start running through those. And then any we don't get answered, we're going to try to post answers to these questions at a later date. But why don't I start off, this is for you, John Borman. First one's a fairly straightforward question. Do you know if there's any data on the size of the striped bass populations on the Hudson River before Indian Point started to operate?
Not really. Personally, no, I don't. I suggest checking with the Hudson River Fisheries Unit at DEC in New Paltz. They may have some information. I only know that they were abundant, not super abundant. The year classes in the 1950s were pretty strong, so they probably produced some decent fisheries in the 50s and 60s, nothing like we saw in the 70s. But other than that, other than anecdotal information, I think that DEC would be the best source of data for that.
Okay. And then one other from, that was from Frandon. Well, this is from David Secor. And back in when you were working on entrainment impacts in the 70s, relied heavily on the estuarine transport model, the ETM model. So if we were to redo that today, are there new empirical modeling approaches that might provide better estimates? And two, more importantly, put entrainment in the context of other stressors. So be able to deal with more than one stressor, as well as be a better way to model.
Of course, I've been out of the power plant since the mid-1980s, early 1980s. So the last I was in contact with the regulatory agencies, they were still using the ETM, for example, in developing offshore liquid natural gas facilities in the Gulf of Mexico. The utility companies down there were using the empirical transport model to estimate entrainment impacts for their water intakes out in the middle of the Gulf. And also we were contemplating using it on the Mississippi River when they were going to extend the navigational season by raising the height of the river a bit in the fall and the winter. They were going to use the empirical transport model there. In that case, the barge or the tugboat that was in the barge would serve as the power plant. In other words, entraining fish in its propellers. In this case, the power plant moves and the water is stable, as opposed to the Hudson, where the water is tidal and the power plant is stationary. Other than that, I had also been in contact with EPA, and when they passed the regulations for 316B, finally, about a decade ago, they were requiring use of the ETM as a method for estimating impacts of intake screening technologies. It can be used to incorporate other sources of risk. If you expand it right now, in its original form, it just gives an estimate of entrainment-related mortality in solely entrainment mortality, but it certainly can be expanded to use it for other life stages and other sources of mortality, as well as developing and extrapolating to population level effects.
Okay. All right, thanks, John. So Jim, do you want to move on to Dan?
Yeah, I'll do Dan. So there's two questions for Dan. The first one is, are there estimates of reduction in biological productivity in terms of biomass as a result of filling in the Hudson River shallows? And sort of the follow-up, would this be a useful metric as we move forward to restoring the shallows? So do you have estimates of biological productivity loss?
I do not, haven't seen anything like that in what I've looked through. I think the way to go about that is to look at productivity per unit area of these places in contemporary times that we have right now, and then sort of just project that back to the areas that the amount of area that we saw in the past. understanding that there's been some other major shifts in the way the ecosystem functions that have impacted productivity, not just the filling. And you know, the obvious one there is the zebra mussels and how they product, or they impact not just the productivity, but also, you know, the availability of that productivity to other species within the river. So it might be tough to tease out, but I think that would be the way to do it.
So just, I think you presented those core maps that had some of this information, but have you actually calculated the total fill that has occurred, you know, in the Hudson, in the shallows, just the actual volumes?
The actual volumes? No, we've only looked at area. I guess that could be done. Again, you'd have to think through how you could get at that, but with you know, with modern day technologies such as LiDAR, you could you know, get a height component to that area off of what used to be, you know, if you assume, you know, the water level height, you could possibly get volumes out of that, and it could be somewhere in the record. I'm sure the Army Corps took records of the amount of material that they were moving. We just haven't looked for it or found that yet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, George, I had a couple questions for you. One is looking at climate change and flooding. So removing barriers, you're certainly proposing as a great way to restore fish passage. But the idea that dams do retain water and potentially floodwaters, do you anticipate, how is that
not
figured
necessarily.
in? Okay.
These are not flood control dams. These are mill dams and industrial dams. And, you know, what we're losing, the water level in a stream is as high as that dam. And so when that dam is filled, we don't have storage capacity. When we drop the dam, we drop the water level in the stream. And so, and then we now have a floodplain that former impoundment can now be like an empty battery that can be recharged with that temporary flood water. And so that's the whole point of using that. You know, out west they have flood control dams, but these were not, well, first of all, these dams were designed in a different era when structural tolerances were much different. Rainfall has increased about 80% in the past 30 years, I believe. So we're expected to have more rainfall. So dam removal is part of a mitigation strategy. And also a lot of these dams, they either have to be rebuilt or removed because there could be a catastrophic breach, and anybody downstream of these dams is in serious danger.
Okay. And interesting, you said these dams were built in another era, and that kind of leads me to Dave Secor's question. We found that your talk very fascinating and really eloquent expression of what comprises historic. So these dams, Dave's point, context here is that these dams were built during a time when we consider Hudson River fisheries healthy. So his question is, why is dam removal now so important for fishery recovery and resilience?
You know, that's a really good question. I've heard that from, you know, it's a tough response. And I've thought about it quite a bit. And a lot of the dam building actually occurred in the 20th century. You know, Theodore Roosevelt is the one that created the Bureau of Reclamation. And the country set about to dam rivers because it was considered unharnessed power, or, you know, control of landscape of rivers was a human domination of rivers was seen as control or aesthetically appealing. So a lot of the dams were actually built in the 20th century. And you can look at, I think it was Sweeney et al., Curran's husband did a paper on dam building in the Hudson Valley, and a lot of it occurred in the 20th century. And then I believe there's a synergy of industrial fishing increased. And then we, in a lot of these lentic systems, we added all these predators. And, you know, or in these rivers, we added predators. We have channel cats, black bass, centrarchids, other centrarchids. I just think it's death by 1,000 cuts. And what I think it also hints at is bycatch is still a problem. And I think unless we have observers on these boats out there. I think we need to show that bycatch, but we can also look at the maturation, the changes in the maturation level of these schedules of these fishes. They're getting shorter. So it's not 3 to 5 years, it's getting less. So what does that indicate? That there's a fishery induced evolution that's occurring. So I think it's a synergy of all the problems.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, George. Jim, do you want to move on? A couple
Les.
questions for Heather?
I'm trying to get 2 in for Heather. First one, Heather, the question of electromagnetic fields and radiation and how they might influence fish movement. The question is, has there been a lot of work done, or at least some work done to understand this, or is this really sort of cutting edge and a real unknown?
Well, back in 2012, it was when we were through this process, it was a definite unknown. Where we're using models that were using ambient electromagnetic field impacts underwater. So it wasn't an appropriate model, but at the time it was the only model. So I think if we scroll to, say, 2021, all that offshore wind work that's being done, there's a lot of research being done, and a lot of that information can be found on the ROSA website, which is Responsible Offshore Alliance. And on there, it's supposed to kind of take all of this research that's being done associated with offshore wind. And I believe that we can take some of that information from buried cable and offshore wind and apply it to other transmission projects. So it's a little bit of both. It's a mixed bag. It's still in the beginning phases, but there is work being done right now on that.
Right. And maybe the last one is from Lingard Newson. She's questioning about the Empire State Connector and whether why isn't that being required to co-locate with existing highways?
I have gotten to see the very preliminary routes. There is a lot of co-location with the Empire State Connector. I believe there's some recognition that they couldn't just come in and propose something parallel to the CHIPPE, the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. It just wasn't going to be feasible, especially with the way that our coastal habitat language has changed through the process of the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. So at this point, many projects, it's difficult to co-locate with highways and transmission corridors because sometimes they don't support vehicle traffic as well as the power corridor. So like I said, the Empire Connector is still in the process. And from what I can tell, some of it is co-located in the highways and some of it is popped into the waterways, but it's a much smaller percentage than the other, the Champlain Hudson Power Express. But it's all preliminary still.
Thank you. And thank you for all I think we're just a few minutes over. So thank you everyone for joining us and sticking with us. Chuck, do you want to make a comment about sort of upcoming series? And well, I forget the date.
Sure. So, hope you can join us again next week for part 3, which is looking at the potential impacts of climate and introduced species on Hudson River fishes. And another mix of speakers coming from far, near and far away. So I hope you can join us for that. And then following that session will be a what's it all kind of mean session. Get a number of the speakers back together, give a big picture view, and have more time for interaction with the audience. So I hope you can join us for both of those. So Thank you to the speakers today, and thank you for everyone who joined us.
Yeah.
We had well over 100 of you.
140, I saw. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.